Hello everybody, this is BKC back in From the Depths on the engine design platform. And I've been experimenting a little bit with in the last couple episodes we went into the how the engines use the core formulas versus the exhaust formulas, and I was referencing a few percentiles on some of these motors that honestly I really didn't know. So I kind of wanted to nail them down. What were some of the percentages? And the supercharger percentage is super easy. You just run a motor at 100%, and you look at the carburetor at the bottom. It says connected to one supercharger, which provides an efficiency increase of 1.05. So the original efficiency of the motor, and it takes off an additional 5%. That's at 100% load, and at 1% load, you see it's a 43%. So a supercharger is on the core formula. It's very easy to figure out. It tapers off from 43% down to 5%. And I was just by doing basic calculations, I estimated it was somewhere in the 30 to 33%. But the way the math works out, if you just do like a hard 30%, that's not really what it is. It's 43%. And since what it is if you're trying to figure out an efficiency, the number works out to be like 30% more efficient. But if you're trying to take a larger number and take away a percentage of efficiency, you have to divide. So it's 40 when you take the original motor and you divide it by 1.43 efficiency. It works out to about a 30% efficiency. That's where I was getting those numbers from. But the actual percentage is 43 at 100% load. I mean at 1% load, and a 5% at 100% load. So that is the actual formula for the way the core formula uses the supercharger. It's really just take whatever fuel usage it uses and divide it by the percentage at that RPM. So if it's like 1.24 efficiency, you would take whatever the core value formula is, or whatever the fuel usage is, and then you would take and divide it by 1.24 if that's what the efficiency of the carb is showing up as. But then when it gets to the turbos, it gets a little more complicated, because not only do we have it's inverted compared to the turbo. I mean the supercharger. It's inverted. It gains power as RPM rises. You also have the variable of the exhaust, and then you have the variable of multiple superchargers. And I would still always argue that a turbo is better than a supercharger. And then superchargers, I haven't tested it to see what the actual percentages are, and the only motors I really do it on, like this motor right here, is sharing a supercharger. I haven't really tested out the formulas on that yet, but because in most cases I would say turbos are more efficient across the board, and the only time to really use a supercharger is if you wanted to just knock down, you had an efficient motor, but it really wasn't efficient at the low end, and you just wanted to kick down the efficiency at the low end some more. There's no real way to do that with a turbo other than gang piling a whole bunch of carburetors and turbos to where you can get like 10 and 15 turbos connected to a cylinder, but then that becomes space inefficient. So getting your exhaust gas up to over 100 to make a motor efficient at the bottom end is not the way to do it. If you just needed a quick bump and efficiency at the bottom end. A supercharger is still the way to do that really quick. The point of this video is to try to determine what is the best turbo usage and where it starts to fall off. So what I have here is a single cylinder motor that collects 4 exhausts, 1 carburetor, and it just vents out. And all that 4 exhausts really would do in this particular situation, this uses, depending on what, if you look at a perspective of a injector, it doesn't use a lot of fuel. But if you look at a perspective of my efficient engine platform, it uses a lot of fuel. And it would actually have a 3x3 binding box. Since it doesn't use a lot of fuel, you probably wouldn't need 4 exhausts, but to keep it consistent across the board, we're going to make it a 3x3x3 motor. And if we notice that when we go into 1 turbo, the 3x3 binding box has not been broken. We was able to put a non-inline turbo on there and not break the binding box. All we did was change this from a through pipe to a corner pipe, and then we had to add an extra, the cost of the turbo, the cost of the J pipe to get the exhaust out in relatively the exact same space. So the cost is an extra 5.25. I think it's a quarter of a material per pipe. So it's an extra 5.25 material cost to get a extra turbo in. So technically it should be more efficient in the same space. So that would, if that was true, this motor would be obsolete. There'd be no point in ever using this motor. So then when we go into the 2 turbo, the only material cost improved is another 5 and then another 0.25. So we got the same material cost increase again, but we still haven't broke the binding box space. So right off the bat, you could see that this motor would be something you wouldn't want to use. It should be a little more efficient than this, but it still shouldn't be as efficient as this. So you probably don't want to use this, and then this is more efficient than that, all in the same space. So right there, without even looking into the numbers, we should be able to see that this is pretty much the best bang for the buck right off the bat, without even going any further in depth. Because we're using the same space, we're making the same power. This should be more efficient, and then this should be more efficient than that. Regardless of how the formula works, math is math. Twice of a gain is always going to be twice of a gain versus no gain, some gain, and then twice the gain. It should always be better. No matter how the formulas work out, this would be better than these. So that obsoletes those. And then when we get into and then regardless of how the formulas work, 3 should be better than 2, and this should be better than that. But then the problem here, if you notice, the only place I could connect is on the top or the bottom of the carb to get the third one. And if I ran the supercharger out this way, if I ran the superchargers out the sides, inline would stick past the binding box out this way. If I did them with non-inlines, the exhaust pickup would be facing these superchargers, and I wouldn't be able to connect anything. If I went on the bottom, both the inline would push out in the binding box this way and this way. And if I put a non-inline, it still would just bring out the binding box 1 extra above the carb. So right here we see that we're starting to increase our binding box. So this is our baseline. This has an efficiency increase without increasing the binding box. This doubles the increase over the secondary motor still without breaking the binding box. This gives us an additional increase of efficiency, but we're starting to have to give up space. And so when we go into the fourth turbo, putting an extra, we're actually using more of the binding box that we stick out above, because we're getting 2 turbos for the same cost of breaking that extra binding box in the front. But we run into a problem where the original turbos can no longer cross over right here. They have to join over the top of this, further increasing the binding, we're breaking the binding box in an additional space. Now, there may be a way to twist this around and maybe reduce some of the binding box costs a little bit, but it really just illustrates the point that if all of these are equal steps up, we're starting to give up more space by violating the binding box. And then once we violate the binding box, we could start fitting more turbos, but then that causes the problem where we have to violate the binding box again. So we have an additional increase of space. And then when we go to the fifth one, now we're still violating the binding box in front of the carburetor. We're still utilizing all that space. We still have to cross over this pipe here, but now to get this extra turbo on, we're actually having to violate the binding box again. So we're violating it in front of the turbo to get another, which actually lets us use 3 more turbos, but to plumb it up, we're violating the turbo on top, and we're violating it in front of where we already violated the binding box. So this is a clear illustration that if the turbo gains are linear, up until the 2 turbo point, in this design, we're not giving up anything to gain efficiency. So these become obsolete, and this would be what I've always felt to be the most efficient, but never been able to demonstrate it. And then here we're gaining the more efficiency, but we're having to violate the binding box to get a bigger motor. And since they don't make any power, one doesn't make more power than the other, the density is starting to drop. The efficiency is going up, but the density is starting to drop. The density gets even worse. The efficiency gets better. The density gets even worse. And so in 5 turbochargers, the density gets even worse for more efficiency. So if all the gains were linear and the drop off in the density was linear, it would basically be whether or not you had the room to do it to save the fuel. But that's what we want to investigate. We want to investigate how the formula looks at the turbochargers and how is the gains. Because if we look at this turbo, we got a 54% increase, and in this turbo we got a 54% increase. And so I wanted to investigate and see what happens. So we have our baseline motor here with no turbos. And so this is our 0 turbo motor. I wrote it down at the bottom. And then when we get into the turbo motors, I wrote 1 turbo, and then I wrote down the gains at the 3 percentage points so we can test to see if there's any gains. We see that at 10% we get a 119 power per fuel, and then it drops. It gets worse as we increase the RPMs, and we use 0.5 fuel, which is pretty interesting because at 10% low we'd use 0.1. At 0.5 we use 1 to 1, 1 to 1. But then when we go to 100%, the motor goes down to 83 power per fuel, which you would assume following the first 2 numbers, arc, we would have a 1 fuel use per second. But we end up having a 1.2 fuel use per second. So what that tells me about our baseline motor is that we're falling off in efficiency, and no matter what, we would want to have some sort of efficiency part on it, no matter what. There's no reason to build a motor without any efficiency part on there, because after 50% somewhere, it starts to fall off in efficiency and starts drinking more fuel than the power that it's making. And so that moves us into the first turbo motor. What happens in the first turbo motor? Well, at 10% we get an 8% efficiency boost. At 50% we get a 31 efficiency boost, and at 100% we get a 54 efficiency boost. So if we compare the first motor to the second motor at 10%, we go from 119 power per fuel to 128 power per fuel. So we've gotten more efficient, but I would say who cares? It's just a number. 119 to 128, it doesn't show up in the power, the actual fuel usage. We're still making 10 horsepower and we're still using 0.1 fuel. So it's really kind of irrelevant. And then at the mid-range, we go 100 power per fuel at a 31% efficiency, which we notice is, 100 power per fuel at a 31% efficiency from 100 should be 131, and that's exactly what it is. So what the formula in efficiency formula is doing is adding that to power per fuel, and then we've dropped from 0.5 fuel down to 0.4 fuel. So I haven't figured out, or I don't really see any clear cut, because when you get into formulas, it's not just real clear. When you can say, oh, this uses 0.1 fuel, and you could just say, well, fuel is calculated by using power per fuel plus this minus this, with this in brackets and stuff. It's harder to find out what the formula actually is, but what it seems like it's doing is it seems like it's calculating out 2 to 3 decimal point places, and it's making up the power per fuel number, and it's in some kind of a lookup table where, say at 119 you're going to use 0.1 fuel at 10%, and then maybe if you get over to like 200% or 200 power per fuel, you would use 0 fuel at 10%, which is kind of irrelevant because you're only making 10 power. Who cares? That's not that much of an efficiency rating. The only place it would really be relevant is if we was using this as a generator. At 100% it would come on. It would spend like a tenth of a second in that 10% range where it uses 0.1 fuel, and if we had a 200 power per fuel where it uses 0 fuel, it would just spend 1/10 of 1 second in that range, and instead of using 0.1 fuel, which it might round down because 1/10 of 1 second using 0.1 fuel might round down to 0 fuel anyway, so it kind of becomes irrelevant versus using 0 fuel for 1/10 of a second while it revs through that point of the power bed is still rounding down to 0 fuel. So I'm not really too concerned about the low end. I'm more curious about the top end, and it's real clear to here because we got a nice round number, and then with a 31% increase we got 31%, and then it probably, like I said, looks up at a lookup table that at a 50% load at 100 power per fuel you're going to use 0.5, and at 131 you're going to use 0.4, and I don't know what these ranges would be. It's probably just like, say, maybe from 129 to 129 to say maybe 145 or 150 or something like that. It uses 0.4 before the rounding error drops it down to 0.3. So that's really all I'm concerned about. I'm not really concerned about the power per fuel numbers. They do show that it is more efficient, but the actual fuel usage numbers shows us what the actual efficiency is. So even though the motor got more efficient at 10%, it didn't change the actual fuel usage. We're way above where the rounding error would drop us down. And then in the mid-range, we drained a 0.1 fuel usage per second. So that's going to be our 100% increase. 0.1 fuel is 100% of our difference. And then when we go into the 100% load, we go from 1.2 at 83 power per fuel, which I would mention is not much better. I think injector motors are in the 60 power per fuel, so an inefficient carburetor motor is still more efficient than an injector, but not by much. And then if you want to get into the argument about what is better, if you're going for small space and you don't care about fuel efficiency, well, then I would still say the injector is probably better because you get 200 power in the same space. Actually, you could put 2 injectors with 3 exhaust and get 350 to 380 power. So, that's not really relevant. What's really relevant here is that with no efficiency parts, it drops off. What it should be 0.1, it's 1.2. And then when we put our 54% increase in efficiency, even though we have a larger efficiency number and we have a smaller power per fuel to multiply it by, we still get 128, which makes us drop to 0.8. And that's pretty incredible. And I found the numbers interesting here because it seems like it flattened out the power band, because at 10% we're using 0.1 fuel, and then by having one efficiency part, whereas over here 10% was using 0.1, 50% was using 0.5, and then here it should be one fuel per second. This one starts to taper off, and like a turbo should, at 0.1 for 10, and then we get 50 per 0.4, and then we get 100 for 0.8. But it did flatten out because, it gains in efficiency as you rev the motor, which I always argue is the better way to go anyway. But now we're starting to get more back. It's gotten flatter and linear, where 0.4 is at 50%, and then you double it to get double. It hasn't fallen off. That's what I found more important. And then 128 is not very far from 131, and at 100% we went back to 128 again. The numbers is not really, it almost seems like the power band has flattened out with one turbo. So that's what I found really, really interesting. And then I brought up the question after I built this motor and tested this one. I was like, well, wait a minute. Now, what is the second turbo going to do? Because will it just double these percentages? Like, will I have 16, 62, 108? Or will it keep the numbers and then just remultiply it again? And if it doubles, if it just adds the percentages together, then you basically just going to put turbos on until you get the efficiency that you want. And basically the more turbos you get, the more efficient it'll be linear if it just adds more percentages together. So if it goes 16, 64, 50, 108, the percentages are just going to be multiplied from this base engine, and it's just going to be a linear rise in efficiency, and it's nothing going to be very interesting. But if it's multiplicative, meaning that it stays the same, each turbo is the same, but it keeps multiplying again and again and again and again, the more turbos are going to start growing exponentially. And that's what I wanted to find out, so I built the third motor with the 2 turbos. And over here on the 2-turbo motor, we haven't violated the binding box. The density is exactly the same because we're making the same amount of horsepower in the same amount of space. The cost has gone marginally up, but if we gain fuel efficiency, the cost could be negated over the life of the engine because of the fact that we're going to use less fuel in our craft. So it really becomes important about whether this is multiplicative or just additive. And once I built it and I tested it, the turbo gains on each turbo is exactly the same. So it becomes whether it could still be additive. We could still have a 16% efficiency boost where we would just take, let's see, 183. Well, let's do it at 100 because 100 is the easiest. 100%, 100 power per fuel at 50% at a 31%. Multiplied twice would be 172 point something, and if we add it twice, you know, if it stays 31, which it did, but it multiplies 31 times 31 again, we're going to be getting what instead of 100 and then bumping up to 131, the next 31 is going to be more than 31 because it has the extra 31 to multiply by. And that would be a cool thing because as you add more turbos, it starts growing exponentially. So that's what I was really truly interested in. And once I've got the third motor built and I tested it, the top end goes from 119 to 128 to 139, but practically it still uses 0.1 fuel. And so probably what we're seeing here is we're probably using like 0.089 fuel, and then we take 8% off of that, and it's 0.0, which, you know, rounds up to 0.1, and we're taking 8% off of that, and so we're using 0.086 or 85. That still rounds up to 0.1. And then here we're adding an additional 8%, which makes it 0.0. Even if it's 7.9, it's still going to round up to 0.1. And that's the low end. And we really can't increase that too much because we just can't get enough exhaust to get the efficiency to a really, really, really high number. But the turbo boost stayed the same, but we went from 128 to 139. But we're still using 0.1 fuel, and we're still making 10 horsepower in the same space. So practically, it hasn't done anything. It's just put up. My dad can beat up your dad. Look at my internet points. My motor makes a higher number power per fuel than your motor, and it really doesn't do anything. So that doesn't tell us anything by itself. It doesn't really tell us anything other than the fuel usage that we're using is so close to 0.1 actual fuel usage that adding efficiency parts can't knock that down. I'm sure if we put a supercharger on there, one of these might actually get knocked down to 0.0 fuel per second. But for practicality, we're just trying to do turbos right now, and in practical use case, it doesn't do anything. But in the mid-range, 100 would be 131, and then it should be 172 roughly if we've multiplied the 31% twice, and it should be 164, 162 if it just adds them together. It just takes whatever the benefit is and just adds it again. And what we got is the 172. So what it's telling me is that for each turbo that we gain, not only are we gaining another 31% on top of that, we're gaining 31% of the original 31%. So the motor should grow in efficient exponentially. And then when we get to 100%, you know, we get from 83 to 128 all the way to 197. And you can see where the numbers are starting to get bigger numbers and post up better stats. But what are they doing for us, you know, in reality? Well, at 10%, adding turbos has only added cost. It hasn't really done anything from us other than just post up bigger numbers. In the mid-range, we've gone from 0.5 to 0.4 to 0.3. So we've added another turbo, and if you call this a 100% difference from 0.5 to 0.4, we've got another 100% difference. So that's really incredible. We've added another turbo, and we've not seen a diminishing return. We've got 100% change each time. So that's pretty good. And then when we go to the top end, we go from 1.2 to 0.8, which is a 0.4 difference, and then we go to 0.8 to 0.3, which is only a 0.3 difference. Percentage-wise, it may be the same thing. Percentage-wise, if you calculate it out, it may be the same exact thing. It may be the same difference because we don't know what the decimal point places are. This rounds up to 0.8, and this might round, up to 0.5. It may be 0.4 something and rounds up. But you kind of would expect that in this scenario, because here we have such a big number at 1.2 fuel, and then we take 54% off of that. And like I said, the way the formula works is it's going to be 1.2 divided by 1.54, and that gives us 0.779, which would round up to your 0.8. So that's the way the formula works here. And then if we do it again from the 0.8, since we have a smaller number, it might be the same amount of change. It might be the exact same amount of change, which we know it is because it's 54%. But we're now taking whatever the difference is of 54%, and then we're doing the bigger number, well, the smaller number, we're giving it another 54%, which would show up the benefits of the original 54%. So we're getting 54% of the original 54%, but we're doing it with a much smaller number. So it shows up as, even though the percentages are exactly the same, it's showing up as a diminishing return, whereas we have 1.2, 0.8, 0.5, and it should actually get smaller, a lower percentage, unless you run into some wacky situation where at one turbo it rounds up, at two turbos it rounds up, and then at three turbos the number drops, and then the number's not big enough and it rounds down. Then you might see an anomaly where you got like, well, three turbos was better, but it's usually just a rounding error. So, but the good news here is that the formula is multiplying it twice, which makes the benefits of the first turbo, it's multiplying the benefits of the turbo by the first turbo by the second turbo, and it's going to grow exponentially, which is a good thing. But then I start to realize, I was like, well, a carburetor only has 5 sides, so yes, it's growing exponentially, but the fuel efficiency numbers are going to start getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So overall, the gains are going to start getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Even though we're multiplying it more and more and more times, we have smaller and smaller numbers. So with the first turbo, we took a good chunk off, and then we're going to take that percentage of a chunk, which is already a smaller percentage, and then we're taking a larger percentage of a smaller number, and so it's going to show up as diminishing returns. So I started to say, well, that's probably why, another reason why 2 turbos is the best bang for the buck, because the cost is almost negligible. The binding box hasn't been broken, so the density is still the same, and we've gotten more efficient. And if we do it again, we're going to start losing. We have smaller numbers to choose from, even though the percentages are going to be the same. If it follows this trend, the percentages are going to be the same. We're just going to multiply because when we're doing fuel efficiency, we're not adding and then adding to that addition. We're actually removing some, and then we have less to remove from, even though we have bigger. We're multiplying in more percentages into a smaller number, and so it shows up as a diminishing return. So the next motor, once I finished this, I was like, well, the next motor is going to probably be more efficient, of course, because you have more turbos, and we got additional. It'll probably stay 8.31, 8%, 31%, and 41%. It's just we're going to be doing it 3 times, and then we have smaller numbers, so it probably won't get much better. And so then I built this motor and I tested it, and again at 10% load, we're going all the way from 119 to 149, but we're still using 0.1 fuel. So what has given up the extra space and the extra cost of another turbo gotten us at 10%? Nothing. It hasn't gained us anything so far. So at 3 turbos, it still hasn't gained us anything. All we've got is a more impressive number. In the real world or in our campaign, it hasn't done anything for our fuel efficiency, but I'd still argue at 10% on a 100 horsepower motor, that's 100% wasting power anyway. So I don't really care about the 10% range. I just want to see if the 100% change from here at the mid-range went to another 100%. You know, a 0.1 is a 0.1 is 100% different between this motor and this motor, and we got it here, and then we got it again here. So in the mid-range, adding another turbocharger has netted us the 100% change that we've seen in the first 2 previous motors, because we went down from 0.5 to 0.4 to 0.3 to 0.2, which I don't really care about the power per fuel numbers, which a lot of people like to focus on. Yeah, that's an impressive little number, but it's not, you know, what do we actually gain in the real world? And we've maintained our 100% across the board. So at this point, we have to start asking ourselves, well, is that extra 100% worth it? Because by adding 1 turbo, we got 100% change. By adding 2 turbos, we got another 100%, the same 100% change. And then by adding the third one, we've got the same 100% change. And I would argue that yes, it is worth it, unless you don't have the space. But if you do have the space, that turbo is giving us more efficiency at the efficiency range. So if you ran a boat kinetic drive with 2 small propellers, and you was running at 50% at all times, I would say give up the extra space for the turbo to save on space on your fuel tanks, or extend your what is it called? The operational range of your craft. And then at the 100% load, we went from 1.2 to 1.8 to 0.5 to 0.3. So once again, we dropped off 0.4, and then we dropped off 0.3, and we've dropped off 0.2, and you can see where it's continuing to give us diminishing returns, because that 54% being multiplied is working against us, because as we take fuel consumption off, yeah, we're multiplying a higher percentage again back into this numbers, but we have a smaller pool from which to put the higher percentage back into. So that's where our diminishing return is coming from. So on a kinetic drive motor, I would say it's definitely worth it, because if you're going to spend 90% of your time in the 50% range, we've gained 100% change across the board every time we added a turbo. But we're starting to get a diminishing return on the top end, but I would still argue that it's still more efficient, and that the turbos, the 2 blocks of extra turbo, I think it's just 2 blocks extra turbo and 1 extra pipe. Yeah, same exact layout. No, matter of fact, it doesn't cost anything. It just adds the turbo, because this corner pipe to make the exhaust go up just lays down and the turbo goes on, and then so it's just the cost of the turbo and the space. And across the board, we have dropped the numbers from 0.1, 0.5, 1.2 all the way down to 0.1, 0.2, and 0.3. So that's actually a good change. But you also notice that we're giving up space to gain efficiency. So we're bucking the triangle, whereas up until this point we weren't giving up anything. The only thing we're really giving up is cost. Here we're starting to give up density, because we're making the same power in less space, but we're gaining efficiency. So we're losing density. It costs the extra turbo, which if you're in a campaign and you can't afford a turbo on a craft, that's just 5 materials. You have bigger problems at that point, because you can't make fuel. If you can't afford 5 material, you can't make fuel, and you need super efficient motors because you can't make fuel because you have no materials. So I would say that we are starting to hit diminishing returns, but it could still be argued that this is still worth it. When we get into more complex motors, I would say 2 turbos is easier to plumb up and probably get you a denser motor, whereas to get that extra efficiency, it's harder to plumb up 3 turbos per carburetor, especially when you start sharing, because if I have this shared with 2 cylinders, there's going to have to be a cylinder somewhere on here, and then so I'm going to have to go around the connection to the next cylinder or something like that, and the density is going to start tanking. And so the point of where does 2 turbos or 3 turbos better, I would say it doesn't sit on either one of these. I would say it sits in between. 3 turbos, we start losing density, and we start getting some complexity in our designs. The cost goes up, the density drops. We got to start being more clever with our layouts. Whereas 2 turbos, we starting to gain we haven't gotten to where the adding all the extra complexity has really, there's more efficiency to be gained, but the layout and the density isn't affected, and it's just easier to design motors with two turbos per carb. And so the point is that right here is where we start, have to decide how efficient do you want to go, how much space do you have, but at no point would I recommend this or this over this. And then it starts to be questionable whether or not you should go up to this. If you're looking for more efficiency and you got the space, I would say yes, it's definitely worth it. And if your motor, you can actually design a motor where you can share carbs and all that stuff and start getting, ultra efficient. And that's the other I would say that would be the other argument for the 2 turbos not being ideal, is that you probably can't go ultra efficient with this. You can get efficient, but you're not gonna get ultra efficient. I would say you could get up in the C-class range somewhere, but you're gonna have a tough time pushing a B or A rating, and it's going to be impossible to get a 0 fuel motor like this one. with 2 turbos per carb. So that would be the argument against it. But I would say it's still between these two somewhere. The line lies between these two, and then if you're looking for really efficient motors, I would say the argument starts to become between this one and this one, because we're starting to fall off the diminishing returns, and we're starting to use up more space. So what happens when we multiply in another turbo? Well, again, we go from 149 on our 3 turbo motor to 161 on our 4 turbo motor, and efficiencies of course stay the same on the turbo, but we're just multiplying it again. So it's another my dad can beat up your dad, but real world it does absolutely nothing for us. But do we maintain the 100% change? We went from 0.3 to 0.2, and yes, we went from 227 to 297. It was an impressive number, but our fuel consumption hasn't gone down. So here it shows that the 4th turbo either is hitting some kind of wacky where this is using 0.18 or be like say 0.154 or something fuel per second, and then this is still using 0.152, and it just still rounds up to 0.2. That would be the only situation where you could argue that it's still better, because it's still using the same fuel at the same power, and it's taking up more space. We have a lower density, and we gain nothing from the 4th. We haven't gained anything except a more impressive number on the 10% range, and we haven't gained anything in the mid-range. So at this point is where I would say, well, we've fallen off, where we're using more space and it's not really giving us anything at this point, especially on a kinetic drive. Now if we go to a generator motor where we're turning it off and we really don't care about the 10% and the 50%, you can't negate it totally because the motor is going to be revving through the power band when it turns on, and would still use some fuel. But I would argue that if we've gained more efficiency in the top end, it negates some of the mid-range usage, because these two motors use the exact same fuel when they're revving up. But when we actually get into the 100% load, this goes from 303 at 0.3. This one goes to 465 at 0.2. So we've gained still a little bit of efficiency. In here where we've gone from, nothing was gained on the low end all the way up to 4 carburetors, nothing, turbos, nothing was gained on the bottom end from adding any of them. So nothing changed. But then when we got into the mid-range, we got a 100% change, another 100% change, another 100%, and then we didn't get nothing here. Probably because we've got like a 80% change, which is not enough to round it down, make it round down to 0.1 fuel. So adding that turbo so far hasn't given us anything, and then since the turbo has a smaller fuel number to use, the power per fuel is starting to skyrocket. But since the formula, however it works for fuel usage, is such a small number already, there's less to take away from it. If you keep cutting a number in a third, it's kind of like the what is it? It's a theological argument that you can't argue against, but you just know it's not true. Like going the distance from where you are now to the moon. If you cut that distance in half every time, if you cut the distance in half and then you cut the distance in half again, and you cut the distance in half again, and you cut the distance in half again, theoretically you would never ever get to the moon, because the distance could always be cut in half, cut in half, cut in half. Sure, there'd be a point where you're standing on the moon and you could still say, well, technically you're not on the moon. There's an air gap between the soles of your sheet, and you could cut that down, and you could say, well, you could get down to the molecule, and then you could say, well, you could cut the molecule in half, and then you could cut and you get down to an atom, and you could say, well, you could cut the atom down to a half of an atom, and then you start getting in the space between the particles in the atom, and you can cut that in half. So the argument still would stand and still could be true. You could never technically get to the moon, but because of the argument, but you know that's not true. We cross distances all the time, but it's always been an interesting thing that's stuck in the back of my head. And it's really just an argument of when you start getting to smaller and smaller numbers, you need to take larger and larger percentiles of smaller and smaller numbers to show the same results. So what that equation really shows, if you cut something in half, the numbers just keep getting smaller, and technically you can never get to zero. You can never get to a 0 point when you start taking a whole number and cutting in half, cutting in half, cutting in half, cutting in half. You can never get to zero. There's always going to be more decimal places to go. And since from the depths rounds off at a certain point, we've just missed the boat right here. And whether or not that extra 0.1 fuel on the top end, which is the only difference between the motors, is worth the extra cost of the turbo and the extra space it takes, because now we're binding the box. The motor went from a 3x3x4 here, and it's gone to a 3x4x4 here. Is it worth it for that extra 0.1 fuel? I would almost argue, say no, it's not, and that's why 2 to 3 turbos per carb is probably the best, because now we're giving up more space, and our change is even less. And then here's another quick point. It's not really relevant to all motors, but here we still have the flexibility, which we'd argue we wouldn't ever want to use this no matter what. But if we want to try to shave that bottom end off, we could still put a turbo without busting the binding box. I mean a supercharger without busting the binding box. But since this is more efficient and can do everything that this motor does and can still put a supercharger here, this is irrelevant. And then since this is more efficient in the same binding box than this, and you could still put a supercharger on the bottom without breaking the binding box. I wouldn't put it on the top because that breaks the binding box, but you could put it on the bottom without breaking the binding box. This becomes irrelevant. And then when we get to this, we still gain that efficiency, which is across the board better. We could still put a supercharger on this at the bottom. When we get to this, we're giving up more space, and we've given up flexibility because there's no connection point now where we can put a supercharger in here and connect it to that carburetor. So we're using more space. We're pushing past the point of diminishing returns, and we've lost flexibility in our design to where we could add the supercharger if we wanted it. Now I could still get a supercharger on here by putting inlines right here like I did on this motor and come out around the carb and put a supercharger. But now if we wanted the supercharger, we have to give up even more space to gain it, and this motor keeps its ability to add the supercharger without busting the binding box, because we're busting the binding box to go to the fourth one, and then if we wanted a supercharger on it, we got to go bigger on the binding box, and we still haven't gained anything. So this motor with the supercharger on it, I would say, would be still more flexible, because we did have to give up some density to go for more efficiency, but we still retain the flexibility of this motor to add a supercharger on the bottom. So this motor it's more efficient. It posts some better numbers, but we're starting to fall off in diminishing returns with the efficiency, and I just don't think it's worth it in the density that we're giving up. If we had the space, if you have the space and it's just a little auxiliary backup generator to get you some extra charge, in case you got a battery backup system all perfect, and you got your craft to where RTGs are charging your batteries, and when you take damage to a certain section, if an RTG goes down, then it starts bringing your horsepower down so far that you start losing shields and all that stuff, and you wanted to gain a little generator charge motor for to back up until your RTG was repaired, and you had the space, I could say, yeah, go ahead and do it, because you're probably going to have small fuel tanks and you want to get the most out of them, and this is still efficient as that. And if you don't care about the space, then you're going to want the most efficiency. So in that case, you would say, well, if you're going to go for this, you're probably going to want to go for the 5 superchargers, because you don't care about space. So what happens in the 5th supercharger? Well, when we put the 5th supercharger in, the binding box is the same for the crossover pipe to cross over the top turbo, but to get the 5th one in there, we have to make the space above the carb available, so we have to break the binding box again. So this motor is now a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a 3x4x5 instead of a 3x4x4. So we're giving up even more space to gain more efficiency. So what happened in that? Well, what happens in that, we go from our original 119 all the way up to the 174, but we're still drinking 0.1 fuel. So we have not gained anything from adding 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 turbos on the low end. And that's really easy because it says in the description, turbos affect the top end. And with not feeding enough exhaust into them, I mean, if we were feeding 100 exhaust into these, they might start affecting the bottom end enough. It might push the power band so low that it actually does affect the bottom end, but we're just not seeing it with 4 exhaust. So we have gained absolutely nothing other than a more impressive number on a sticker, which doesn't do anything for you in battle. In the mid-range, though, whereas over here we got that 0.5 to 0.4, then 0.3, then 0.2, but then we didn't see it here. Like I said, that's probably a rounding error. It has dropped off enough, but it still rounds back up to 0.2. So it probably drops down to like 1.5 or 1.6, and it's just not quite enough to round it down. But it shows up in the 5th motor. So that's probably, so the difference here is probably a rounding error. We've got 100%, 100%, 100%, 100%, and then 100% change. Well, actually, the 100% change is just doesn't show up because it just rounds up. It's just the change from 0.5 to go down to 0.4 was a solid number. To go down to 0.3, it was a solid number, or it was, this might actually be dropping 1.2. 0.12, and this is actually dropping 0.11, and this is dropping 0.1, and then this is only dropping 0.8, and it just doesn't show up. Here, it kind of adds the percentages up, and it actually gets to where it actually does round down. So this is probably a rounding error. but all the arguments still stand that this takes up much space, and since it's a rounding error, the game doesn't care whether it's actual true efficiency or it's actually a rounding error. This is going to drink 1 fuel every 5 seconds, and this is going to drink 1 fuel every 10 seconds. So here you would say, okay, well, on the top end it still hasn't done anything, but we haven't gotten anything so far at 10% load, which I would argue is useless anyway because you can't do nothing with 10 power. And then at 50% load, if we was going to run just 2 propellers, it just becomes really an argument of space. Are you willing to give up that space? Because if this did follow the rounding error, if this just wasn't right on that curve of where the rounding error didn't show up, and this was 0.1, then we would be arguing whether or not adding the 5th turbo is worth it. And in this case, since it's gotten over the rounding error, you kind of almost would say, yeah, it's worth it, but is it worth it going from a 3x3x4 to a 3x4x5? And I would probably argue it's probably not, because the amount of fuel you can put in that extra space over this is a lot. And it's almost hard to make a case for this motor. And then when we go into the top end, like I said, once we go from 1.2 to 0.8 to 0.5 to 0.3, we're only gaining 2 back here. We're only gaining 1 back here, but it has gone past the rounding error, and we've still, where we received 0.1 here, you would say, well, we're only cutting that in half, so it should be 0.1, but if it was 50% off, technically it should be like 1.5, which would round up back to 0.2, and we wouldn't see it here. But it probably, since it's 0.54, that 0.54 is added up over time, and it's got us to the 1.1. So this thing uses 1.1 no matter what fuel range you use it in. And the case starts becoming whether or not the extra cost, the extra space, is worth the extra efficiency. Now when you get into more complex motors, like I said, it starts becoming harder to do that at the 2 turbo range. 3 starts getting harder, 4 starts getting almost impossible, because we only have one side to share, to where 4 turbos start seeing as 8. Whereas here you have 2 positions where you could share, and you could actually, if you could get this carburetor to share with 2 more cylinders and still put 3 turbos on it, if you're sharing with 2 other cylinders, this acts like 9. This only has 1 space. This could only act like 8. So we're getting into the diminishing returns also of what sharing could do. And then when you get into 5, you can't share anything. That carb can't share anything with anything. You just have that maximum efficiency. And then also noted that you lost the flexibility to add a supercharger. So if we actually get into what's better, the argument for this is just, if you argue this is the best, I can't even come up with an argument with this is just the best. So using this is just, at that point, pure mental illness. The argument for this, the only thing I could say is just cost. But like I said, if the argument comes down to, oh, I can't afford 5 material, 5.25 material, you've got bigger problems. And then when you get into this, the gains is so much better. And it's an additional 5.25 cost. We didn't bind the binding box. We're more efficient. This is the best. We've got 3 sides of the carburetor open for sharing, so these 2 can actually turn into, it would be 2 here, 2 here, and 2 here. So this could act like 8 turbos if you could share effectively. This could act like 9 turbos if you could share effectively. This would start taking a lot more space but could act like 8. So if this could act like 8 and this could act like 8, design-wise, it's going to be a lot easier to design an engine that these turbos act like 8 than what this can. And then this is limited to 8 because it can only share with one other cylinder. And so you'd have to try to fit a cylinder in there some kind of way with enough room around it to share with another layout like this to get another 8 into that other cylinder. So it starts becoming harder and harder design-wise. And then when you get into 5, you start losing flexibility altogether. You can't share at all. And so there we have it. 2 is probably the best bang for the buck. 3 you could make an argument for. 4 we start to get to diminishing returns and we're starting to have space. And then 5 was able in this particular case to push past the rounding error in the mid-range and still had enough in the top end to where we could still see a benefit. And the motor in this particular case, the 4 turbo is actually the loser if we wanted to go with just one cylinder. If we started to go into multiple cylinders, I would have to cut it off at the 3. It started to get hard to make an argument for here. And then we still lose flexibility in the motor. So let's go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and add a supercharger to it and see what happens. So in our baseline motor, we use 0 fuel at 1%. Hurrah! We use 0 fuel when we make it almost 0 power. And we use 0 fuel all the way up to 9%. So we can get 9 horsepower out of this motor without using fuel. We can't do anything with that. So that's not really, like I said, that's just mental illness at that point. And if you're going to put one efficiency part on, the turbo motor by itself kicked this one's butt across the board. And then this motor uses 0 fuel at probably 10. Nope. Okay, so it went from 0.9 to 0.10. So we went from 9 horsepower to 0.10 horsepower, where we could get free fuel usage. So we haven't gained anything here either by putting a turbo. So one of the benefits of these is they're more flexible without breaking the binding box. But when we put a supercharger, they still don't do anything for us. So we haven't gained anything by adding that supercharger, which is another reason why I say superchargers are kind of dumb. If you look at it from a perspective like, ooh, I'm going to gain efficiency with my supercharger. No, you're not. You're not going to gain anything is what you're going to get. So this one uses 0 fuel. Okay, up to 10. It still hasn't done anything for it. We're into 2 turbos and it hasn't done anything for us. Now, does it do anything for us in the top end? Yes, it probably does. Because even though it tapers off at 50%, let's see if it adds anything. We're at 0.2 fuel, so it's just dropped another 0.2 fuel in the mid-range, which is what adding another turbo here has done. So that's pretty good. It's made us a 0 fuel at least some percentage of the power band, dropped another 0.1 off at the mid-range, and at the 100% range, I don't know why I keep closing the tab down, we're still using 0.5. So all it's really done is dropped another 0.2 off at the mid-range. So I don't know if that's really worth it right there. Just even though we didn't break the binding box, it's still just material cost, and it's very little gains. It's almost like the gains from, the 4 versus the 3. But then I think where we see the 3-cylinder is going to be the one that's going to shine probably. As far as a zero fuel motor, we're using zero fuel. It hasn't gained, we haven't gained anything on the last one, so I don't expect to gain maybe 10, 11 or 12. Yeah, okay, now we can go up to an 11 power and not use fuel. So we could run an ammo processor at 11, but then we can't power our boat. So it really doesn't, I don't see that as a beneficial gain at the 10%. If it could keep us down below 0.2 and get us 0.1 at the 50%, that would be an incredible gain, and it can't do it. So it hasn't done anything. At this point, if we're trying to get any more efficiency, we're better off going to another turbo. And at the 100%, I doubt it's going to knock us down. 0.3, no. It just, there's not enough there. 5% of 0.3 is just, it's not enough to, it's like 0.015. That's not enough. Unless this was sitting right on the edge of a rounding error, it wouldn't be enough. So superchargers, like I said, the useful case I see for them is if you're sitting right on the edge of a rounding error. Sometimes you could throw a supercharger on there and see if you're really close to a rounding error to see if it's worth going up to another turbo, because they have bigger advantages. And then you could put the supercharger, put the turbo back on, test it, put a turbo back on, a supercharger on, added to it to see if it's real close to a rounding error again, to see if it's worth going up again. But adding a supercharger on all these motors really hasn't done anything for us. But I hope it shows you guys that if we keep the consistent exhaust in turbos and keep it consistent across the board, going from no turbo to one turbo is good. Going to two turbos, you're getting whatever the turbo, you're getting double the benefit of the first turbo, plus you're multiplying the advancements of the first turbo into the second turbo, and then it does it again with the third turbo. I hope that makes it clear why I've always felt that 2 and 3 turbos is the way to go, and I don't really 100% know the line where it is beneficial. You have to start, calculating in, can you give up the space? Do you have room for extra fuel on board and all that stuff? But that 2 and 3 turbos is pretty good, and only when you're going for really ultra efficient does this make sense, because ultra efficient always gives up space for efficiency, and a lot of times they give up power, so you give up power and space for efficiency. And I hope that makes this makes it clear to you guys, and I'll see you guys in the next one.